Matthew Bolton of the CBC, speaking from Italy. At 8 o'clock this morning, I was bumping over the tank rut into the outskirts of Ortona. There was a strange silence, and I surmised something. I got into the command post of a Western Canadian unit in the heart of the town. Only a few machine guns were clattering, only an occasional enemy shell was falling, and bearded men who hadn't had their boots off for 30 days were laughing. The colonel grinned when I came in. I said, "Don't tell me." And he replied, "Yes, I think we've got Ortona. There's a patrol going through the fort now. And if they find no Germans there, the thing is over. We'll know any minute." Not 2 minutes later, the radio buzzed, and Corporal Bill Colville of Edmonton took the message from the signaller at the fort not 400 yards away. Then he took off his earphones and turned to the colonel. "Sir, the Jerrys have gone, or else they're all dead." Ortona was ours. And so ended the Battle of the Moral River, one of the most savage Canadians ever fought. After 21 days of hard enough fighting, the Canadians had had 7 days and 8 nights of fearful battle in Ortona against one of the best units ever produced by the fierce Germans, the 4th Parachute Division. Demons of men. And now the battle was over and won at no small cost. I left the command post and walked down a narrow street, an office street, and came to a little square which had better not be described. Continuing down another street, I came to the ruins of a 3-story building. I looked through the rubble and saw several mangled German dead. This was where the battle ended last night, in a pitch of heroism and ferocity. For the last 2 days, the fighting had been a frenzy from house to house. C Company of one of the Western units, under Captain Bill Longhurst of Edmonton, had fought its way into one building and fought its way to the top, stair by stair and room by room. Then they had to get into the next building to kill the Germans there. So they blew holes in the wall, captured German sticky bombs, and threw hand grenades through the holes, and then crawled through and started fighting their way downstairs, down the stairs, or blowing holes in the floor and shooting down. But meanwhile, one officer, the regimental interpreter, crawled close to a window of this building to hear the Germans talking. He heard an officer upbraiding his men for having let the Canadians get into the top floor. Then the Canadian crept away and found some of our engineers. In half an hour, the engineers had placed charges of high explosive under the building. And after the Canadians on the top floor had been warned to get out, the building was blown up, and 40 or 50 Germans in it were killed or crushed. This was a revenge, because we had lost men that way. And that will tell you, perhaps, what kind of a battle has been going on in Ortona for 7 days and 8 nights. Men blowing holes through walls and fighting their way down from top to bottom of a building in a hellstorm of machine gun bullets and hand grenades. Thousands of hand grenades, potato mashers, as the Canadians call them, were used in this demonic fight. I looked round there, horrified. Captain Vic Foley of Edmonton was telling me stories, but I hardly heard them. Though I remember him saying that at dusk yesterday, in the last-minute convulsion, a young Italian woman found buried alive was delivered of a baby by sergeants in Vancouver, both doing well. The mother well enough to say that her baby's second name was Canadese, meaning Canadian. I went slowly down another main street and came to another square. The buildings were either empty shells or piles of bricks and rubble, some covered with dead Germans and blood. And this havoc caused by shells, not bombs. On one pile of rubble, precariously balanced, killed by an anti-tank gun and set on fire as if attacked, was a Canadian tank. And I see it now as I speak, as I shall always see it. Not static and dead, but dynamic in that minute when gallantly it climbed the mine-filled pile of rubble only yesterday and was struck down by an anti-tank shell.
From London, the National Broadcasting Company presents War Telescope, a review of the war week and a forecast of possible developments to come. War Telescope features Elmer Peterson of NBC's London staff, a veteran reporter of the European scene. And for his regular Saturday report, we take you now to London.
This is Elmer Peterson in London. For Britain, this is the 227th week of the war. It's been a sensational week, full of promise for the future. We've had some amazing demonstrations of Allied air power, a continuance of the non-stop air offensive that has now run for 9 days and 8 nights. We've had the return, with a great deal of publicity, of General Montgomery, something which the average Briton takes as an unmistakably clear indication of impending action. And the Germans undoubtedly see the point in this. We've also had new statements and new evidence about the final and extensive preparations now underway for the invasion of Western Europe. Then, and by no means least, there has been the news from Russia and the reports of deepening gloom and despair in Germany. Today, as example, the British are reading reports from Stockholm that events in Europe may take a dramatic turn at any moment now. Under the circumstances, you would expect the British people to be buoyantly optimistic, and they are more cheerful about the future. Still, 4 years of war can cut a deep pattern in your thinking, can give you a deep-rooted caution in your views. It may be, too, that this particular time of the year here in Britain, with the blackout curtains drawn tight early in the evening, isn't conducive to taking too bright a view of things. At any rate, one has the impression that the British people as a whole are merely waiting now, for the most part. Certainly the conviction that final action of some sort will be forthcoming soon is deep and solid here now. Also the feeling among many people that they can't do much more than wait in any event. For there are two widely general views current here in Britain about the immediate future. One is the theory that there's going to be a sudden and dramatic blow-up in Germany. This sort of thinking is being fed, and very well, on the highly encouraging reports that come in from neutral capitals in Europe, such as the one today in the London Daily Express. According to German sources, says this dispatch, tension in the Reich over the retreats in Russia and the Western invasion threat has reached a point never before touched. And reading the news from Russia and the accounts of the endless air raids on German war industries in German cities, the average Briton wonders at times if there may not be something to this theory, that Germany can't hold out much longer. But there's another view of the matter that's being put before the British people steadily, and one they accept on the whole. That's the theory that the defeat of Germany is going to come out of a long and bitter battle over a period of months, and not through sudden collapse. The evidence being submitted here is that the Germans still retain great organizational powers, that the Germans can still move armies about quite efficiently, that we have yet to see what the Germans can produce in the way of secret weapons, that the German leaders, with the extremists once more in charge, obviously are determined to exploit every advantage they have left. There are all sorts of individual bits of evidence being put out in this connection. It's true the Germans have lost some 16,000 miles of railway track in Russia, but a large number of locomotives and freight cars have thus been made available for shifting troops in Europe. True, the Germans have had some hard blows to their navy, but they're making a tremendous last-minute effort, it seems, in building U-boats and small coastal craft to defend against invasion. It's true that great sections of Berlin have been destroyed, and one theory here is that complete destruction of Berlin means a collapse of the Nazi war organization, but this has yet to be proved. And despite weeks of rumors and speculation, Germany still retains a good hold, it seems, on her satellite nations. So there's a fairly realistic attitude here about the events of the next few months. It's obvious that the Germans are going to be punished severely, but it's also obvious that the German leaders are determined to exploit every ounce of energy out of their own people, and they may put this over for some time to come. Much depends, of course, on how well the Germans can continue to stand up against Allied air attacks. Not because of the effect of these air raids on German civilian morale so much, but the effect on German war economies. That's why the raids now being made on Germany are so important. Their success will determine how much resistance the Germans will be able to put up when the land battles start. It won't be the big air umbrellas over our invasion troops that will make the road easier for them in Western Europe. What is really cutting away the resistance are these raids on German factories and supply lines. These raids which daily see more German fighter planes being destroyed. Now, American planes of the 8th Air Force have played a great role during this past week of non-stop air attacks. Over hundreds of miles of enemy territory. They've bombed and fought off opposition in the air. They've shot their way into Germany, and they've shot their way out again. at a minimum percentage of loss. But the skill and courage and efficiency of these American airmen doesn't end when their targets have been bombed, when they're on their way home. For a certain amount of American planes do come back damaged from these raids. Now and then there has to be a crash landing with varying degrees of emergency. These crash landings may take place in a farmer's field. Most of the time they take place on special airfields, fields specially equipped for repair, general overhaul, and reclamation. It's a further demonstration, this, of the ever-developing efficiency of the American Air Forces here in Britain. It's something that helps give the pilot of a damaged plane a real break when he has to come in with a belly landing. And some of the facts about these crash landings by flying fortresses are really amazing. The forts, as you know, are rugged ships. They can take a lot of punishment, even when they're landing with their landing wheels out of order, with one or more engines silent. And so about 75% or more of the fortresses that do crash on fields under proper direction go back into the air after repairs have been made. Furthermore, there's no record of any fatal casualties where the forts have crashed on these special fields. In fact, it's seldom that the crews get more than a bruise, if that. But all this doesn't detract from the high drama of these crash landings, the skill and courage and efficiency that's required to bring a badly damaged plane down and bring it down safely. It doesn't detract from the anxieties and fears and worries of the men on the ground, the men who are watching these damaged planes make their landing. What it does do is demonstrate, and very effectively, that the organization of American Air Forces here in Britain has now been perfected to make every possible saving of human life in airplanes. To give you a better idea of what's involved in these crash landings, we have with us here today in NBC's London studio a man directly concerned with them. He is Major John F. Rooney of Louisville, Kentucky. He's in charge of field maintenance units of a strategic air depot of the 8th Air Force. Major Rooney, how would you explain the purpose of these crash landing airfields?
Well, it's obvious that the pilot naturally would like to land at his home field. But if he does make a belly landing on his own field, he runs the risk of tying things up for the other planes that have to land. He might block up a runway. For this reason, these damaged planes are directed toward non-operational bases where we can eliminate a good number of the hazards in crash landing. These bases usually have a larger area of grass or soil to make the landing easier. Not only that, but the officers in the control towers are highly experienced in guiding a plane into a crash landing. On the whole, you might say that the pilot has a better chance. Moreover, the plane is then on a field where repairs can be facilitated.
Well, it seems to me, Major, that you fellows on the ground must see some really remarkable achievements by the men who bring in these damaged bombers.
Yes. How remarkable depends on a lot of factors. On the time of day, for example. How much ground fog and haze there may be around the field. To what extent the plane still has the use of all its controls. Then there's the wind to consider. If the control cables were shot, for example, the pilot may not be able to maneuver to take advantage of the wind. Shortage of gasoline also may be a factor. However, the boys do bring them down under any and all conditions. They have plenty of nerve, these pilots of ours. They certainly keep cool in the pinches.
But is there anything the members of the crew can do to help their crash landing?
One thing they try to do if possible, and if they have time. They try to loosen up the ball turret and drop it. They do this so they can come in level and have the plane land with a minimum of damage.
Now, which planes, Major, are directed towards these special crash landing fields?
Those which have something wrong with their landing gear. Either their hydraulic system has been shot out, or the tail wheel damaged, or the tires blown by flak. Otherwise, if the landing gear is in order, the planes can get down on their own field.
Well, what happens, Major, when a damaged plane has to crash land as best it can, away from these special fields where you have all the emergency equipment?
In that case, they land in the best field they can find. And then it's up to our mobile repair units to patch the plane up. And some really fancy repair jobs are done by these mobile units. Some very fancy flying, too, when a pilot takes a repaired ship off some farmer's field. Some of these mobile repair units, by the way, have repaired the same plane as many as 3 times, and in widely distant parts of England.
There's another angle to these crash landings, as I understand it, and that's how the pilot of a bomber feels about it. So we also have with us today First Lieutenant Randolph Jacobs of Fort Wayne, Indiana. Lieutenant Jacobs made a really spectacular crash landing after the first raid on Schweinfurt on August 17th. And just a week ago, he had to put another plane down in the English Channel. Now, first of all, Lieutenant Jacobs, you pilots, as I understand it, have your own interest in saving a damaged plane.
That's true, chiefly because we get devoted to our own plane so much that we'd much prefer to have our plane repaired than go out in a new one. That's especially true, of course, when you've been flying the same plane for some length of time.
And your plane, the one you crash-landed, had been damaged pretty badly, I understand.
Badly enough to make a crash landing necessary. One tire was gone, for example, and one of the flaps was shot away. Altogether, we'd taken about 11 20-millimeter hits, and we were short of gas, which made it a bit difficult. I didn't have time to maneuver around the field, so I just bellied it in.
And you had to come in pretty fast.
Yes, at about 150 miles an hour, which is, well...
Pretty fast.
Yes, it's moving for that sort of a landing.
But your plane took it.
Yes, she landed nicely, even though she did kick up an awful lot of dirt. Most of the crew looked pretty messed up with dust and dirt when they got out, but no one was hurt, not a scratch.
Well, tell me, Lieutenant, does the rest of the crew have anything to do? Did they have anything to do in your crash landing?
No, it rests pretty much on the pilot.
And in this case, your crew wanted to try the landing rather than jump.
Yes. I asked them what they wanted to do, and they all wanted to try getting the plane down.
Well, it's a good demonstration of how both crews and planes are being saved, even though forced landings are necessary. And now, could I ask, Lieutenant, what does a pilot think about when he's crash landing a flying fortress after a raid?
As far as I'm concerned, you're too busy to think when you're doing something like that. Too busy to think of anything except to use everything you ever knew and learned about making a plane do what you wanted it to do. And that's not easy. Of course, with your controls not working properly in most cases.
Well, there's an idea of what goes on here in Britain when the raid is over. When, as occasionally happens, one of those powerful great bombers has to come down to earth as best she can. It's all a part of the campaign, after all, to break the hold the German leaders have over the German people by making it impossible for the Germans to continue the war. And there's great interest here in Britain now in what the German leaders have in mind as their final defense plan. One thing seems certain, judging from the latest reports from Germany, and that is that the Nazi leaders are counting on creating as much confusion and destruction as possible. It provides another good reason why the Allied invasion of Western Europe must be sure and certain, with no possibility of failure. Obviously, the Germans expect to see the occupied countries devastated by prolonged battle. They hope, too, that this devastation may prove a factor in getting the Allies to agree to some terms by which the war might be shortened. That a situation may be created still, in the end, out of the coming months of bombing and land fighting, where most of Europe will be thrown into complete chaos. That the Allies will find it necessary to make a choice between offering Germany acceptable peace terms or developing these chaotic conditions that will take years to remedy. And there are circles here in Britain that believe that the unconditional surrender formula should be explained better now to avoid a really systematic destruction of Germany, to avoid creating conditions in Germany which may lead to conditions of anarchy. However, it seems doubtful that any new declarations to the German people are scheduled for the immediate future, at least. It seems doubtful also that the Allies are going to be lured into invading Western Europe until such time as they can move with complete precision and efficiency. The invasion fears now current in Germany, the daily listing of places where the Allies may land, are regarded here as no more than a good example of German efforts to encourage the Allies to move before they are ready, and while the German armies are better capable of dealing with invasion. It's obvious, too, that the Germans will try to the end to exploit any possible political differences between the Allies. Their retreat from Russia, now so clearly indicated, may be followed before too long by a retreat from Finland and the Baltic states. A retreat guided by necessity, but also a quick retreat, in the hope that Russian occupation of this area of North Europe will pose new political problems for the Allies.
You have been listening to War Telescope, a weekly report on the war by Elmer Peterson of NBC's London staff. And here's a bulletin from Moscow. Premier Joseph Stalin has just announced the fall of Kirovograd, German defense key in the upper Dnieper Bend. This is the National Broadcasting Company.
From London, the National Broadcasting Company presents War Telescope, a review of the war week and a forecast of possible developments to come. War Telescope features Elmer Peterson of NBC's London staff, a veteran reporter of the European scenes. For his regular Saturday report, we take you now to London.
This is Elmer Peterson in London. Whether Hitler himself will survive this war will always be a matter of speculation. He may be the victim of an assassin's bullet. He may be a suicide. He may die a natural death. But one thing is fairly certain. If Hitler does die before the end of this war in Europe, his death will be announced as being a natural one, no matter how he comes to the end of his days. For that would be, for those Germans who are looking far ahead into the future, the best way of making Hitler a martyr. The best way of letting him continue as a symbol of what Nazism stands for. The best way of keeping alive German hopes of someday winning a world war. Among other things, Hitler's death might provide the German High Command with a partial reason, at least, for surrender. And to that extent, it may be a most deliberate affair. This thought on what may happen in Germany this year was expressed to me here in London the other day by a man whom I regard as an expert student of the war. It's not just an idle remark on possible future developments. Instead, it's the sort of thing that carries a grim note of warning for the future, something worthy of consideration. It falls in line with an observation that can no longer be ignored, namely that the German High Command is no longer out to win the war as such, but is going all out to win the peace. That the German High Command will stop at nothing in cunning and trickery and deception in its efforts to get out of this war in a position to start another one sometime. In a way, it falls in line, too, with something that must be realized clearly now. Namely, that responsible Germans are far more confident about the future than is generally realized, and that they have their own reasons for this. In any event, the shadow of the peace is beginning to fall across Europe alongside the shadows of war. I mention this because you may be interested in knowing something of what people are saying and thinking over here in Britain when they consider the difficulties that lie ahead, not only in the matter of defeating Germany, but in defeating Germany in such a way that her ambitions towards war and conquest are killed, and killed very effectively. There is, of course, no precise pattern here in Britain in methods of getting information about German strength and German plans. There are the actual tests and demonstrations of German strength. Last night, the RAF lost 55 planes out of an estimated 1,000 planes that raided Germany. It's an indication that the Germans can still defend against attack. And last night, we had about 90 German planes over this country. Not a large number these days, but it's an indication that the Germans can still hit back. If you had been here in London last night, listening to the savage thunder of London's guns through 2 raids, watching the searchlights at work, hearing the shrill whine of planes in the sky above you, you would have realized that Germany is by no means finished, that Germany still has something in reserve, offensively as well as defensively. If you had been here last night, you would have found it a bit difficult to say that the war in Europe is all over but the shouting. The Germans may be retreating on their eastern front, but they are still in possession of Western Europe. They can still put planes in the air. In addition to these actual events, there's a great deal of information available here about Germany. I could take you with me to great and complicated offices here in London where experts analyze present conditions in Germany, the effect of air raids, the effect of lack of housing, the state of German war production. I could take you with me through London streets to buildings where governments in exile are quartered, buildings where you can hear all manner of languages spoken, and where you can talk to persons recently escaped from Germany or the occupied countries. I could take you with me to crowded London hotels where you can talk to travelers from neutral countries. But all this information is something you have to sort out and digest as best you can. In the last analysis, it depends on the way in which you can evaluate what you learn against your own experience and knowledge of Germany and the Germans. My own impressions are these. We are getting ready to attack Germany in the West. We are getting ready here in Britain to hit Germany a powerful and final blow. That much we can take for granted. But the Germans are getting ready to meet this blow, and they still have their own hopes of blocking it as a means of prolonging the war, in order to intensify the war strain here in Britain, to encourage their own people, and, they hope, to discourage the people of the United Nations. Moreover, and highly important, the Germans are planning far beyond the fact of their inevitable defeat, their foreshadowed surrender. They're busy now taking a long-range view of defeat. They are already preparing the underground organization that will operate under Allied occupation. If the Poles and French and Norwegians can fight underground, why can't the Germans, who should by this time, after all, know all the tricks of underground organization? Not long ago, I am told, Hitler held one of his meetings with his high-ranking officials. It was, from all accounts, a strange conference. It had nothing to do with plans for great offensives, nothing to do with measuring out new campaigns on headquarters maps. Instead, Hitler devoted himself almost entirely to an elaborate discussion of his own ideas of war weariness here in Britain. He orated on his latest belief, namely that a partial sort of victory might be gained in the end if the war can be continued long enough. And this time, it seems, the German High Command agreed with him, for their own particular reasons. From all accounts, as I get these reports here in London, Hitler did not make this a front-line conference. In fact, the Fuhrer spends most of his time now at Berchtesgaden, willing enough at last to leave military matters with the German High Command, which is important. What's being recognized more and more here in London is that it's the German High Command that we must contend with chiefly in the final moments of this war, both militarily and politically. This in turn raises the question of what the German High Command is after now, assuming that it has now decided that complete military victory is impossible. The answers here in London are clear enough. The German High Command wants to save itself as an institution. It wants to keep the land war off German soil. It wants to get out of the war with a feeling still strong in the German army that the war was lost by political errors, not by military failure. It wants the best peace possible, but it also wants to have Germany finish the war as intact as possible in its industrial capacity. In short, the German High Command is scheming now to achieve the best possible circumstances for surrender. What the German High Command wants and what it's going to get are, of course, different things entirely. But as one pieces together the information available here in London, its plans may be something like this. First, to retreat out of Russia, fighting all the time to cut down Russian reserves, in hopes of eventually holding a line beyond which the Russian progress will be very slow and costly. By that time, the Germans may hope to send more of their strength into Western Europe in an effort to block the coming invasion. And by the time the Allied air raids on Germany undoubtedly will have reached the stage where the German High Command can use these air raids as an excuse for surrender, and it will have to have an excuse. Not only an excuse for surrender, mind you, but an excuse for forcing a military government to replace ostensibly the Nazi regime. Hitler will have to be taken out of the picture completely, and his death, real or accidental, shall we say, might prove a valuable argument for the German High Command. In any event, what must be borne in mind as one sees the situation from here in London is that the German military leaders will prefer to surrender with the excuse of air raids on German cities than to surrender with the admission that the German army has been defeated. The blame would thus go to the Nazi Party. And as I have said before, there is good evidence that the German soldiers, who are still fighting hard, with no signs of failing morale, have been quietly indoctrinated for a long time now, with the idea that the Nazi Party is responsible for the bombing of their cities and homes, not the German army as such. At any rate, it's interesting here in London now to see how the German High Command is being emphasized as the final enemy, and not alone the Nazi Party leaders. Certainly there's a good chance that the final efforts at trickery are going to come from those men in Germany to whom war is a profession, and who are now thinking of possible future wars as well as this one. In all of this, the German High Command has its deep and serious problems. The German home front must be maintained in morale, in production, in transport. There's still a good possibility, after all, that the German war machine, even when turned fully towards defense, may collapse like a pricked balloon under the great and solid blows still to come from all directions. The Germans are, after all, counting on time which they may not get. And if the German military leaders are looking ahead to a third war, and they are, there would be no particular point in their giving up, with German war industry so pulverized that it can never be restored, with German cities smashed to the point where they will be practically eliminated. How and when to surrender is going to be important to the Germans. And there's good reason to believe the Germans, despite their hopes and plans for prolonging the war, aren't going to get all the time they need and want. Quite aside from the invasion of Western Europe, they're going to be subjected from now on to an ever-increasing weight and range of air attacks by Allied strategic air forces here in Britain and operating also from new bases in Italy. I can report that heavy American bomber strength is being constantly increased for this purpose, both in planes and crews. At the moment, it's officially estimated here that American air forces, through their great raid on Schweinfurt and subsequent raids on German fighter plane factories, have destroyed about 40% of German fighter plane strength. And there will soon be a full-scale crisscross air offensive against German factories that will be unprecedented in effectiveness. Lieutenant General Karl Spott, commanding general of the newly created United States Strategic Air Force, both here and in the Mediterranean, had a word to say about this today. In his first press conference in his new headquarters somewhere here in Britain, He faced some 75 war correspondents and made a simple, direct statement that bespeaks the future very well. Our sole objective, said General Spot, is to drop the maximum weight of bombs on the right targets in Germany in the quickest possible time. And so we are approaching, as I view the situation here in London, a tremendously vital period in this war. The Germans have their plans and they're gambling on time. Time to get back to something like a one-front war if possible. Time to put through new campaigns to encourage discord among the Allies. Time to pretend that they're getting separate peace offers from one side or the other. Time to devote to defensive measures entirely all their undoubted ingenuity and organizational ability. Time, for that matter, to decide carefully the question of whom they want to surrender to and when they want to surrender. And let there be no mistake about it, the Germans are going to fight to get that needed time. Still, it's no longer a question, really, of whether we can win this war in Europe. It's also a question of whether we can win it the way it should be won. Beyond the problems of invasion, there are the possible great problems of how to deal with a situation which the German army may surrender without admitting in its collective heart and mind that it's beaten. How to deal with a situation which the German High Command may, through the very medium of its surrender, try to play one side of the United Nations against the other. In their new efforts to propagandize separate peace rumors, the Germans show they haven't lost any time in trying to take advantage of that published rumor in a Moscow paper. Here in Britain, you can sense the developing tension now as we move towards this time when the final showdown will come. The British people may be optimistic, but they don't expect to have much time to be complacent. Last night's raid on this country and on London have only strengthened the belief here that the punishment and sacrifice of this war in Europe is by no means over. It's freely admitted that the Germans aren't going to try to block the invasion by measures on the continent alone. The Britons expect to have a good share again of the flame and fury of air raids. The British Home Guard may yet have its chance for action in warding off retaliatory land action in this country. But if the Germans expect the British to break under war weariness, they're mistaken. The people here are weary. They don't welcome the sound of gunfire as we heard it last night, as we will undoubtedly hear it again. But it's going to take some tremendous attacks to break the steady rhythm of the war effort here. Last night, during every break in the barrage, I could hear the clear, steady sound of footsteps along the streets, the clear, unalarmed sound of voices in the darkness. And it was curiously and encouragingly symbolic. There was a steadiness about London last night which was stimulating. And somehow you sense here now that it's a time for steadiness. The days grow longer here. Each day we gain a few minutes more of daylight before the blackout curtains have to be drawn. And little things like that also seem symbolic of the future. And we're getting less and less of the fine-sounding predictions here about the future, which also seem suitable to the present moment. The feeling here now is that this is the time to watch the enemy, the time to give him full credit for what he may still be able to do. This is Elmer Peterson in London, saying goodbye on this program until this time next week.
You've been listening to Elmer Peterson and his weekly war commentary from London. This is the National Broadcasting Company.
From London, the National Broadcasting Company presents War Telescope, a review of the war week and a forecast of possible developments to come. War Telescope features Elmer Peterson of NBC's London staff, a veteran reporter of the European scene. And now for his regular Saturday report, we take you now to London.
This is Elmer Peterson in London. Just a few hours ago here in London, we had a really impressive announcement about the air war against Germany. The announcement that more than 800 American heavy bombers with fighter plane escorts today penetrated deep into southwest Germany to attack targets at Frankfurt. It was the greatest single target attack in the history of this war. In the number of planes attacking a single target, it reflects the enormous growth and development of American daylight bombing in this theater. For it's understood that hundreds of escorting fighters went along, so many that it's possible that 1,800 planes participated altogether. It means that a small army of young Americans today used their skill and courage and determination in an attack on Germany. It means that the 8th Air Force, just starting its third year as an organized unit, is now striking blows such as the Germans never imagined possible, hitting at specialized targets which the Luftwaffe must defend at a price the Luftwaffe finds it increasingly difficult to pay. Now, full details of today's raids are still lacking. However, if each of the flying forts and liberators carried 2 tons of bombs apiece, it can be assumed that some 1,600 tons of bombs went crashing down on Frankfurt, a total which measures up well with the loads being carried by the RAF on their big night operations. The returning crews reported that opposition was light in some instances, vigorous in others. but that on the whole the raid was carried out smoothly and effectively. Some of the crews reported they could see smoke rising above the overcast by the time they arrived over the target. NBC correspondent Ed Hawker was at one of the American bases when the planes returned from this great and concentrated attack. It was, Hawker told me by telephone a few minutes ago, an exceptionally dramatic and exciting scene, hearing the returning airman's own version of the tremendous size of this raid. All the planes returned safely at the base he was visiting, Hawker reported. The airmen Hawker talked to said they saw very little flak and no more than 50 German fighter planes. In fact, they said opposition in the air was light. Apparently, one gunner told Hawker, our fighter protection was so effective, it kept most of the enemy planes below cloud cover. What this raid has done is to put new emphasis on what's going to be achieved during the coming months by Allied air forces here in Britain. For what must be kept firmly in mind these days is that the Germans are fighting desperately for time now. Time to find ways and means of prolonging the war and winning some sort of compromise peace. Time to pull back from their disastrous venture into Russia and concentrate on blocking the invasion of Western Europe. But these steady and shattering raids on Berlin and other German cities provide a factor that Germans must control, or they won't get the time they need. From all accounts, the Germans hope to prolong the war throughout this year, on the theory that this will give them time to find a way out, through their hoped-for complications in Allied military and political strategy. But they can only do this by defending their war production centers, especially their fighter plane factories. They've concentrated their best fighter plane squadrons for this purpose. They're matching their production of fighter planes and their reserves of fighter planes against the great smashing blows such as they received today, and they're losing. The other day, Lieutenant General Karl Spass, commanding officer of American strategic air forces in Europe, said that 40% of Germany's planned fighter plane strength has now been destroyed. There will always be discussion, of course, about the extent to which the Allied air forces are contributing to victory in Europe, and there will never be any real way of measuring that contribution. But we do have more and more reason to believe that these air raids on Germany are doing more than merely destroying German war potential and organization. They're also building up a reason why the German High Command will have to admit defeat. A reason which, and it's a danger that must be guarded against, the German High Command will welcome. In preference, that is, to admitting complete defeat in land warfare. What the 8th Air Force and RAF are hitting at now is the very core and kernel of German willingness and ability to muster a complete and solid defense against invasion of Western Europe. Here in Britain, it's impressive these days to watch American soldiers preparing for their tasks in the important days to come. And not only their prescribed preparations, the things they must do. As you meet and observe these modern American soldiers over here, you're impressed by a variety of things. There is, for the example, the matter of their voluntary interest in foreign languages, something for which they're being given every facility. Personally, I've been amazed to learn the extent of the interest being shown in this. In fact, wherever American soldiers are stationed, you'll find these voluntary study groups, for which the Special Services Unit provides help and guidance. The languages being studied include German, Spanish, Italian, French, and Russian. It's a remarkable thing in many ways. You can look in on a Red Cross club at an airfield, or the library of an army base, and see a group of young Americans busy with textbooks, and busy with specially arranged phonograph records, learning a language in the most scientific manner possible, and learning it because they want to. You can see an American boy who never had a chance to study a foreign language at home, a boy who never would have thought of studying a foreign language, perhaps, but who now spends a certain amount of his time in getting the twists and turns of a new medium of conveying thought and ideas. There are a number of reasons, it seems, for this interest in foreign language study. For one thing, I'm told many an American soldier recognizes that he can be better equipped as a soldier if he can speak and read a language other than his own. He realizes a most obvious fact, namely that under certain circumstances, whether of attack or occupation of a country, the soldier who knows something besides English may be worth 2 men. Another reason, of course, is a natural desire for learning. In some cases, it provides a diversion, an interesting hobby. But the outstanding reason seems to be that many an American soldier has some imagination about his possible future task. He feels that before this war is over, he may be seeing some new countries, and that he might as well get ready for that. At any rate, many of you people at home are going to welcome back soldiers who will be able to trot out some correct conversation in foreign speech, and something not learned from a tourist phrase book. Most of this teaching is being done with the use of phonograph records, and 70% or so of the men studying in this manner are enlisted men. To provide some evidence of all this, if you need evidence, here are two soldier students, Corporal Varner Paulson of Brooklyn and Corporal John McNamara of New York City. Both have studied some French in high school. Both have continued their studies over here. Now, Corporal Paulson, why are you, for example, studying a foreign language over here in Britain?
Why? Because it's so obvious to me now that some knowledge of a foreign language is going to be important in the future. I've got a new ambition to see something of Europe, for one thing.
What about you, Corporal McNamara?
My reasons are pretty much the same. I did study some French in high school, but I promptly forgot most of it. Over here, I've gotten a new interest in languages. I'm brushing up on French now, but I hope to study some other languages as well.
Well, supposing you and Corporal Paulson show us that you really can handle a foreign language.
Well, it may be a bit rough, but here goes. Varner, est-ce la première fois que vous visitez Londres?
Oui, c'est la première fois.
Aimez-vous Londres?
Oui, naturellement. Tout le monde ici est très gentil pour nous.
Où irons-nous ce soir?
Il vous plaira. Pour moi, cela m'est absolument égal.
Eh bien, allons au théâtre.
Well, that convinces me, and it should convince you who are listening, that we're getting an army that can take care of itself most anywhere. All that Corporals Paulson and McNamara had to say today in that little dialogue is that they like London, it's their first visit here, and they plan on going to the theater. But they could say a lot more. More and more here in London, I find myself interested in the part the people of the occupied countries of Europe are going to play in the final battle of Europe. It's something that appeals to my imagination, partly because of the tremendous and complicated scope of this coming activity, and partly from a personal view of my own memories and experience in this war. For this island of Britain is far more now than the assembly point for the Anglo-American forces of invasion. It's also the center of contact, the grand plotting room, you might say, for the millions of people of the occupied countries of Europe. People who now think of deliverance in terms of months and not years. Scattered around London are the various governments in exile. Training for their appointed task are the military units of the various occupied countries. In buildings where you can feel this new tension and expectancy, experts of all kinds are at work, as they have been at work for 4 years and more. You can talk to these people now and get the impression somehow of a giant lacework of contact with the continent of Europe, for the passing back and forth of information and instruction. It's one of the fascinating things about London, these impressions of how much has been achieved in preparation for the great drive for victory. The other day, for example, I met a Polish government official, a man I hadn't seen since some unforgettable days in September 1940. I saw him last on a highway leading out of Warsaw. Behind us, the city was being bombed unmercifully, a city still fighting gallantly and courageously. All around us on the highway was a confusing whirlpool of refugees, soldiers, peasant carts, and trucks. As a part of this scene, Polish officials and experts, the men now working here in London, were on their way to keep the Polish government going. They left their country to continue their work outside Poland. But there were many Poles, as there have been many Frenchmen, Norwegians, Dutch, who could have left their respective countries, but who did not leave. Not only because they had no chance to leave, but because they felt their duty was to remain. There was a Polish woman whom I helped to leave Warsaw. But when our party was halfway to Romania in safety, this Polish patriot changed her mind. He simply said to me quietly, I was wrong to leave Warsaw. I had a moment of panic, but it was a mistake to yield to it. I must go back where I belong. As I recall it now, it was a strange experience watching that Polish woman change her mind and go back into that hell of flame and fury that Warsaw became. Yes, it's these sort of thoughts and memories that impress you greatly here in London now. It's very easy, after all, to get into the habit of thinking of the coming invasion as an Anglo-American affair, forgetting that it's going to be a United Nations affair. There isn't much that can be said about the preparations now being perfected, but there's one point that may emphasize the matter. You must remember that invasion of Western Europe means more than spearheads of highly trained and perfectly equipped frontline soldiers. It means also a vast group of men and women who will work in the rear of these frontline soldiers on matters of supply and communication. And it's for such things as these that the people of the occupied countries have been preparing, among other things. Preparing according to definite and detailed plans, and under conditions of oppression and persecution. There are political complications about the extent of the resistance that may be put up against the Germans in some cases. Certainly the Germans would like to have us believe that they have been able to prevent a great deal of the necessary organization. Still, the simple fact remains that the military assistance from the occupied countries of Western Europe is going to be an important factor in the final defeat of Germany. But this is only one of the things that makes you reflect now on the great and profound changes that have occurred since this war began. It's about 3.5 years now since Prime Minister Churchill delivered one of his famous radio broadcasts to the British people. We wait undismayed the impending assault, said Churchill on July 14, 1940. Perhaps it will come tonight. Perhaps it will come next week. Perhaps it will never come. This same mood and atmosphere is with us now here in Britain, although the circumstances have changed vastly. Once again, the British people are getting set for an assault against this country when the Germans try their final desperate measures to block the invasion of Western Europe. We're getting open warnings here now of what we can expect when the tide of Allied land, sea, and air power flows across the English Channel. Warnings that the Germans may try anything and everything to disrupt invasion operations on this side of the English Channel, through airborne suicide squadrons that will try to sabotage transport facilities in this country, through large-scale air raids, possibly through the weapon of poison gas. But this is a Britain, remember, that has progressed far from those days of 1940. Out of these years of preparing for attack, there also has come a new defense machinery for this island. Whatever the Germans try, they will not succeed, although they may still cause a great deal of trouble. Another change that you sense here in Britain now is the manner in which events are providing the Allies with definite political advantage. One report here today is that Britain may now take parallel action against Franco, following the United States ban on oil shipments to that country. It's assumed that this would involve a suspension of wheat and coal supplies to Spain from British sources, supplies highly important to Spain. It's something that would help impress on the Spaniards, and impress very deeply, the poor rewards of their policy up to now. This is Elmer Peterson in London, saying goodbye on this program until this time next week.
You have been listening to War Telescope, a weekly report on the war as seen from London by Elmer Peterson, NBC's veteran observer in the British capital. Mr. Peterson is presented each Saturday at this same time over most of these stations, and today he had as his guests Corporal Paulson and Corporal McNamara of the United States Armed Forces speaking on studying languages in the Army. So be with us again next Saturday at this same time for another edition of War Telescope. This program came to you from London and New York. This is the National Broadcasting Company.